Pleasure to meet y'all at last, and welcome back to films I should have talked about years ago. And now, let's get on going with something different here. Let me just tell you, first off, I've known about the Aliens films for a long time. As a matter of fact, at a pretty young age, I actually got to know about the Alien series quite a while before I was even old enough to even watch any of them. But here we are in 2021 with the possibility of another new Alien film by Ridley Scott known as Alien Awakening, or maybe Aliens Awakening, because we're going to talk about a film that came out a few years ago, the latest Alien film at the time, Alien Covenant, which was released in 2017. And the way we see it, it's technically the 6th official film in the Alien series, but if you were to count both of the Alien vs. Predator films, including Aliens vs. Predator and Aliens vs. Predator Requiem, then yeah, you could count this as number 8 in the series. But for 2017, not even 40 years after the first one's release, I'd say the series certainly has gotten itself quite a bunch of mileage out there, but at the same time, I'm not necessarily seeing a ton of things out there. This film entirely in its own right, I will say, it does try its best to possibly connect the events of all the other Aliens films combined, because we have the first film, Aliens, which takes place at some certain point in the future, and then there was the sequel, which takes place 57 years after the first one, with Ellen Ripley being in hyperspace and inside of a pod, pretty much. Aliens, of course, gave us a natural continuation with that. And then the third film takes place immediately after, with Ripley and the other remaining survivors from the second film crashing down on a prison planet, killing almost all of them except for Ripley, which, as disappointing as that sounds, I figured that the studio itself would have had to have some sort of continuation take place, and not something that's pretty much redundant. Then Alien Resurrection. That takes place 2 full centuries later, way into the distant future. Man, that was indeed pretty incredible. The fact that the longevity of the series has gotten so far that in the canonical universe that has had quite a big time span within it already, with quite a long time that has passed. The original Alien quadrilogy, with 4 films to count, that had already come around for nearly 20 years, sure did bring a lot of insight on how the series itself might end up progressing eventually. But then of course came the Alien vs. Predator duology with Alien vs. Predator and Aliens vs. Predator Requiem. The way I see it, it's probably not necessarily very important, so I guess we'll just skip those. Meanwhile, we have Prometheus, which supposedly takes place 30 years before the events of the first Alien. The way that the ending of that film actually tried to put together that sort of crash landing, that the same way that the first film had depicted, I tell you, LV-426 was what's in the first film, but in Prometheus, where they try to basically connect it by giving us that sort of crash landing that took place according to what the first film gave us, it actually takes place 30 years before the events of Alien. And according to the canon in Alien, that ship, LV-426, that had crash landed and supposedly held the original alien facehugger eggs, that happened thousands of years ago. So, again, there's just a lot of confusion on that point. But here we have Alien Covenant. It takes place sometime afterwards. But here's the thing about it. It actually does try to give us a similar cue as to what happened during the earlier films. A ship full of survivors goes down onto some sort of planet, hoping to find paradise. But unfortunately, when they do, they come across some rather terrifying sights. Xenomorphs themselves are not necessarily called xenomorphs anymore. They are in fact referred to as protomorphs. And the reason for this is because, if you're probably familiar with what's already been shown in Prometheus, as well as most other storylines that have already been shown, then well, you'd probably be familiar with the fact that this certain substance, which is known as black goo, is supposedly the precursor to what would eventually be the facehuggers. This black goo is capable of altering deoxyribonucleic acid in tons of different ways. And the storyline across all Alien films so far has given us a rather huge, extensive, yet expendable way to explain it all. But yet, with Covenant, it gets even bigger, and possibly even better if you catch the drift. Because this black goo actually does things differently. Prometheus shows that this black goo was in fact able to infect a scientist who then apparently allows pregnancy to take place, which results in what's known as a trilobite. And this trilobite would eventually grow to the point where it would eventually latch on to a host, which of course happened to be an engineer in the film, and then create the Deacon. That's apparently what these new aliens were called. But these aliens in Covenant are a little different. The Protomorphs, as they're referred to most of the time, they're made differently. The black goo is in fact capable of giving us something different. There is in fact these little pods that house tiny spores which can enter through any kind of orifice on a human body, or probably something else in any point in time. And once it does that, it allows for a ginormous backbreaker to burst right out of the host, similar to how the original facehugger latches down onto the face and releases an egg down the throat. And when it does go down there, then you have a chest burster. But here you have a backbreaker, which is certainly different. Chest burst or backbreak. Pretty much take it in any other way. But the thing is that these backbreakers were certainly something different here. And then of course, once they get out, they allow for what's eventually a tiny variant of what the xenomorph itself would be like. So it's basically a different Q. Rather than the chestburster growing into a large xenomorph within a very short period of time, you have yourself something different here. A backbreaker pretty much getting itself to the process of evolution, where it eventually becomes a xenomorph-like entity called the Protomorph. It's morally organic, whereas the xenomorph was biomechanical. And I don't really know how else to put it together, but this film probably just gives us quite a lot to look forward to. If we ever are going to be seeing another new Alien sequel out there, Ridley Scott will certainly want to have a lot of insight take place in order to avert a lot of confusion, and maybe more so with plenty of other things that could distract us from what we might potentially be getting. At this point in time, I can't really be sure if I'd blame anybody for any of this, but we shouldn't forget something here. This film is more average than what you'd probably think about. It got itself a 64% on Rotten Tomatoes, a 6.1 out of 10 on IMDb, and even a 3 out of 5 for Common Sense Media. So at this point, a lot of people are wanting to join on in with this rating sort of thing that takes place. And Covenant really does have a lot to show for it. The way that it gives us quite a big story from start to finish. It tries to be like what the older Aliens were, but even with the likes of various actors out there like Michael Fassbender, Callie Hernandez, and even Danny McBride, of course. And who could even forget Guy Pearce? Man, I tell you, a lot of actors are all over the place by this point. And I don't really blame anybody out there for wanting to like this film a bit more than they should, but that's probably what we're learning from a bunch of newer audiences, ones who are not very familiar with these older films. And being that I got to know these older films at a very young age, I tell you, that really says something. I was born in the 90s, just a couple years after Resurrection came out in theaters. And, well, of course, I was only 5 when the first Alien vs. Predator film came out, and then after a few more years, I was only 8 when the Requiem sequel came out. Then in 2012, I was 13, and then Covenant came out, I was 18. So at this point in time, it's fair to say that if we're going to have a new sequel called Aliens Awakening, then, I mean, right here, right now even, would probably show that maybe I'm just willing to do whatever I can. If I'm able to watch this new sequel, then maybe we could probably get some better insight on what we could probably learn out of this. And you know what? Being a guy who's watched a film like this, I don't really know what else to say about it, but I'm just gonna go and leave behind a score of maybe, you know what, 5.7 out of 10. As hard as it is for anyone to trust me with my scoring, I tell you, a very honest perspective from my own self can really be helpful. This film is really average. Too average that it probably wouldn't even matter. Because it's not really a sequel to any of the other precursors that were out there. Any of the other prerequisites that had been established throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s. That's quite a long time for people to really get their heads together and get a creative team up and running. So, I guess I don't have anything else left to comment on that, but you know what? I guess we'll just leave it at that. So if you want to see more go down on my channel, then make sure that you like, subscribe, comment, follow me on social media, and stay on the Hollywood side.